Great. Deb, I'm so excited you're here. We'll give it another couple minutes. I think it looks like we got like a dozen people now. I'm sure more will be coming, and it's such an important topic. I'm so grateful for you for doing this.
I have looking forward to this one.
Yeah, agree. It is really, as people are coming in, you know, it's been so surprising to me to recognize that kind of what I thought employees had for protections in the workplace are really not necessarily the case. It's really, in thinking about this one, Deb, I was looking at all these kind of Reddit stories about workplace issues and comparisons between what Americans experience and people in other countries. And people had a story about their job was going overseas or closing, and the French employees got 6 months worth of severance. They continued to have health insurance. They continued to have sort of the basic protections in place. And the American employees got 2 weeks, no sort of support to find something new. And I guess I just hadn't realized how much we're not guaranteed any sort of ways of being treated in the workplace or any sort of specific accommodations if things go bad for our company or if we're laid off or so it's one of those things that sadly you do not learn until you're in the experience, being harmed by the experience. But we hope that's why we're here today too. We hope that this information just keeps getting out there about what it looks like when workplaces can't have so much power over their employee experience. And I know I was just noticing someone shouting you out for being at this for 15 years now,
Deb? Yeah. I was bullied back in 2007 and I was like, something needs to be done. So I just was like, okay, I'm going to take my background and see what I can do with it. And it's been a long haul. But back then, I mean, there's so much more in the media about this issue than like, I had no idea what to call it. I had no idea. Even when I did figure out what it was called, there was not a lot online. And now, when we're still going through, we don't necessarily know what to call it, but at least when we figure it out, there's a ton more information online. So
absolutely, that is great. And one of the big things about trauma is we can find other people that have had similar experiences now that we have so much time in the virtual world. Yeah. Welcome everybody. It's so great to see some new people here, some of my big friends who faithfully tune in every month here. Super excited. Bill, I haven't seen you in a while. I knew this topic would bring you out. So glad. And Deb and I were talking about it. I did have Jerry Carbo in, it was almost like 2 years ago at this point now, to talk about workplace bullying. And he was excellent. It's an excellent training. All of our trainings are recorded if you want to go back and look at that. And Jerry's amazing, but I know personally, Deb has been a savior. Deb has been really leading the more mental health end of this experience for quite some time now. And she has so many resources out there that I hope she'll talk about. She does a boot camp. She really, and I know for me, finding Deb and just kind of hearing about many other people's experiences was so helpful in and of itself. It really helped me see that it wasn't about me personally. It was about power dynamics in the workplace, our rights, our rules, expectations, all of those pieces. So I hope people here today get that sense as well, that you can learn a little bit more about what this looks like and how to help and what it does, the harm it does, the personal harm, the financial harm, just in so many realms. Deb, I'm so grateful to have you here today. Thank you so much for being here. Deb Falzoi has started, she does a workplace boot camp. Boot camp. That's a good reminder.
Sure,
If people
014.
can mute themselves while they're not talking, I'm going to just kind of turn it over to Deb in just a minute. And please introduce yourself in the chat. I can see people already are using the chat to talk about some of their experiences, and Deb has left a lot of time for that. So she's going to lay some groundwork today with her slide deck, and then leave it really open for people who want to share what's happened to them and get some support around it. All of those things, people that have questions about something that's happening. But Deb, you know, like just in the last couple months, I've referred at least 4 or 5 people your way that are having these kinds of experiences and are just in so much distress about it. It's so painful. Again, thank you for being here. If people want to use the chat to introduce themselves, that would be great. That gives us a good kind of running list of who's here. We can also use the chat if there are questions or comments that come up as we're going. Other than that, I think I'm going to mute and turn it over to Deb to talk us through. We are recording and streaming all the good things. Heavy topic yet again. Thank you so much, Deb, for leading us through it. I'm going to hand it on over to you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Amy. And thank you for having me. Thank you, everyone, for being here. So we're going to talk about the trauma of workplace abuse. And I wanted to start off with some questions before I talk a little bit about my background. And you can put your answers in the chat. You know, anything that resonates with you as I go on, just feel free to, as Amy said, put, you know, information in the chat about your personal experience around this. So first, I want to know who's experienced a false narrative about you or your work or other types of toxic behaviors that we'll get into, or has witnessed false narratives about others in a hierarchical workplace. Feel free to add to the chat. And then who's felt isolated as a result of that? And then who's believed your employer would care about the damage to you or the organization, but instead you realized your employer is accountable to no one when it comes to mistreatment, unless you can prove discrimination. And that's actually a whole nother piece that we'll get into today. And then this is a different level here, but who's sued for discrimination only to realize you have to prove discriminatory intent, not impact, and that the employer and courts rely on the same stereotypes that left you mistreated to begin with to individualize the problem and vilify you. And then who's seen the COVID effect, this mass exodus of workers, mostly BIPOC and women workers who are burnt out and tired of being exploited. And in the description to this, you know, we said workplaces must change. The workplace is the front line of systemic oppression. And it also is where social change begins. So we're going to talk about that social change aspect too. So I want to talk a little bit about my background. I founded Dignity Together after I was bullied, or well after I was bullied in 2007 in higher education. And after working on legislation for about a decade, I realized that a lot of people were asking about how do I navigate this? How do I heal from this? So I developed online courses, got certified in coaching, offer peer support, and held events, in-person events, and also online to tackle this issue and help people feel connected with each other, help people feel supported and not so isolated in what they're going through. I also head up End Workplace Abuse, which is a brand new group aimed at fighting for workers' rights, all sorts of workers' rights that are forms of workplace abuse, but we're focusing primarily on psychological safety with the Workplace Psychological Safety Act, which is a brand new bill that tackles this issue with a different angle than other pieces of legislation have done. Like I said, I've experienced workplace bullying and mobbing in Boston, and I've pushed for this using my background in marketing and design to really try to build awareness of this, build a base of supporters who, you know, have gone through this and can speak to their own, with their own personal experience about what they've gone through, with testifying at the State House, with lobbying legislators, and I've personally done both in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. So today we're going to go through the basics on what workplace abuse is, the playbook, because this really operates like a playbook. It's kind of, almost shocking how much this playbook resonates with people. The bystander effect, the business costs, societal costs, this big connection to discrimination, the case for legislation. I'm going to give a brief overview of what is in this bill, how we're building a movement, and talk about healing. And then we'll have a discussion where you can share your experiences, your takeaways, that sort of thing. So our goal is to, with End Workplace Abuse and the Workplace Psychological Safety Act, is really to create a national movement to educate people on what this is and to take action on psychological abuse at work, because all workers deserve to work in psychologically safe workplaces. And really, there's so much parallel with this issue to domestic abuse, domestic violence. And we want to make workplace abuse just as much of a household term as that. So that is really our goal, to build this awareness, because it's so isolating, and it's hard for us to come out with our stories because there's so much shame involved. So there are so many definitions of workplace bullying or workplace abuse. I'm going to use this definition of psychological abuse that violates an employee's inherent right to dignity and creates a toxic work environment. It is actually 3 to 4 times more prevalent than sexual harassment alone, making it one of the most problematic issues in the workplace. And this is from the Workplace Bullying Institute. There's a ton of different studies out there as to how many people are actually affected by this epidemic. Anywhere from 6 to 96% of employees in all sorts of different studies that have happened. A common number, though, is around 25% of all employees have experienced abuse at work during their careers. And currently, the majority of US employers respond to abusive behavior with just a flat out denial that it's happening, support for the perpetrator, and then retaliation against the targeted employee for speaking up. So this is kind of getting into the playbook here. And Andrew Foss, in his book, The Bully's Trap from 2014, talked with leaders. He talked with 138 of them, and he found that 71% of them condone bullying. The notion that bullying causes targets to reduce their level of engagement, commitment, and performance was widely rejected. So there is this big disconnect between, how leaders perceive what's happening and what's actually happening. And this is supported again by the Workplace Bullying Institute, saying 60% of employer actions taken to bullying actually facilitate bullying. So these are negative responses, are negative for bullied workers and the organization. So I'm going to dive right into the playbook that is supported by 50 years of research on this subject, and what we're using as sort of an intro to the Workplace Psychological Safety Act. The first step, like Amy had said, this is all about power and control. It sort of starts with this initial conflict between a bully and a target. And a lot of times HR we'll get into that, but they'll characterize this as just a personality conflict. But there is a hierarchy there, and so the power and control here matter. And it is displayed through highly covert attacks in private settings or overt passive aggressive attacks. And there are a ton of different behaviors that can happen. I'm going to focus on some of the more common ones. But as I go through this, and this is in a framework that I use in one of my classes, there are layers of betrayal to this. So at this level, the abuser is the one who is betraying the target, and they are using all sorts of tactics that we'll get into. But there is also this layer of the work culture being toxic. As we just saw, most work cultures are toxic. And then there's this whole culture built on stereotypes and anti-discrimination law that isn't really effective because of pushback from the courts. And this whole system is what is enabling this workplace abuse to continue and fester. So when we look at the abuser lens, the abusers are typically, like I said, coming from power and control. Having that power and control is a sign of worthiness to them. A lot of the data supports that they go for high performers. They perceive those high performers as threats to them. So they're operating from fear, jealousy, insecurity. The high performer part isn't always the case, but it is a common characteristic among targets. They are threatened by vulnerability, competence. This triggers shame in them. They aren't necessarily narcissistic, but there is a lot of narcissism here. There's lack of empathy. They don't see people as people. They're not leading from like a human standpoint. They're not treating people as people. They give excessive attention to their self-image, this idea of having big but fragile egos. They're used to using and manipulating others. They're coming from low self-esteem, lack of self-reflection, denial of their imperfections. They're hyper-focused on their own agendas rather than the agenda of the organization. They see limited resources, so they're competitive, and they tend to create chaos, trying to look important at others' expense. So this is really all about them. And their worldview is actually rooted in childhood trauma. Usually we're receiving conditional love instead of unconditional love. And, you know, and this is one of the ways that it's manifesting in them. So I mentioned talking about these covert and overt tactics. So in our legislation, we've actually identified the actual behaviors that we can go after. There's a lot of discussion of intent or non-intent. We're just going to say if an employer is using some of these most common behaviors, they can be held liable. So those include sabotage, exclusion, misrepresentation of employee performance or behavior. That's actually a big one. We see a lot, especially with a new manager coming in, where they will take an employee who's had great reviews for years, and they will start to control the narrative. They'll start to characterize their performance as negative to start this paper trail to push the employee out. Spreading of lies, discipline that doesn't follow procedure, withholding of information, verbal abuse, frequent requests for work below the competence level of the employee, inconsistent enforcement of rules, long-term assigning of tasks beyond the employee's duties without compensation for it, and then behaviors without just cause. So this could look like physical isolation, ignoring regular inconsistent instructions, unmanageable workloads, just really trying to control the narrative of how this employee looks. And then we get into overt tactics, more obvious things like undermining, requests for taking part in illegal activity, humiliation, taking credit for work, public ridicule, public physically isolating an employee, ignoring. There's some overlap on these lists, but exclusion from gatherings, communications, inconsistent following of rules, degrading role changes that could jeopardize future career prospects, placing someone in a dangerous working condition, and the obvious hostile yelling, shouting, physical abuse, looking into disclosing private facts about the employee or their family. I've seen that a lot. And more behaviors without just cause. So this could be discounting someone's proposals, opinions, persistent criticism, excessive monitoring, again, unmanageable workloads, threat of dismissal, removal of job duties, tampering with their personal belongings, personal equipment, and just changing work conditions or duties, really trying to get under their skin and undermine them. I like to lump all of these. I mean, there's different ways to kind of slice all of these tactics. I like to think of them in terms of some sort of overarching false narrative that plays out with false accusations, with the effect of excluding the employee, and then within that, some sort of job or career sabotage, really trying to kind of push that employee down because they see their high performance as a threat. So in the second step, so we've established this scenario where the bully has decided who their target is and are mistreating them. In the second step, we look at the actual work environment. So this would look like reporting the issue to HR or higher up. And we saw that data earlier about 71% of workplaces being deemed psychologically unsafe, and 29%, or that leaves 29% of being deemed psychologically safe work environments. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how these different work environments typically play out. So in a safe work environment, the employer is actually responsive to the complaint from the employee about this toxic work environment. So they might have, they have a system in place to monitor unacceptable conduct and to manage it. So they don't tolerate this abusive behavior, and they actually deal with the perpetrator by counseling them, training them, or removing them from the workplace. And then in unsafe work environments, they are typically unresponsive to the complaint. So there's that second round of betrayal, called this institutional betrayal. And the employer denies that there is a problem. They reposition the employee as the offender, and they support the perpetrator. This is typically a way to get out of being liable for the harm that's being done. There's a typical advice for targets to not trust HR. They work for management. There should be this expectation that HR is not going to believe them, and they'll deny the bullying. That's not always the case. There are some great HR professionals who want to do the right thing and are trying to do the right thing, but they still work for management, so that they might be bullied too, or they might be limited in what they can do. So when an employee speaks out, the organizational members typically use unethical communication. So this can be failure to act or silence, or they might misuse an investigatory or disciplinary channel to eliminate the targeted employee. And then, of course, strip that employee of their respect, status, and influence. The second layer of betrayal here is what we've talked about. This applies here to the work culture, and we actually call this mobbing. So there are different definitions from mobbing on a very basic level. It's going from bullying, which is one-on-one mistreatment, to group bullying, which would be mobbing. But for our purposes, we're talking about mobbing as that escalation to HR, the employer mistreatment. So this could look like employer non-response, prolonged response to employee complaints. They could have some sort of rigged internal protocol, a willful blindness to the bully's escalating behavior, and a willful deafness to the employee's request for assistance. And then in terms of unethical communication, this can look like misrepresenting a complaint process, an investigatory process, a hollow investigation. I've seen more times than I can count an investigation where HR will interview the employee complaining, they'll interview the bully, and then that's the end of their investigation. They don't talk to witnesses. They just make a judgment on that and side with the more higher level employee because it's easier for them. They might misrepresent the findings in reports, and of course throughout this whole thing there's frequent blame shifting. In the end, the employer might fail to provide a safe working environment. They might fail to acknowledge the complaints, provide a transparent reporting system, adequately address the complaints, remove the known stressor, which is a big part of this, and actually stabilize the work environment. And then, of course, in the absence of them actually stepping in, because they're the only ones in this situation who have the responsibility to step in, it just exacerbates the abusive behavior because the bully is emboldened and there are no consequences for them. I go over this in my class, but I wanted to bring this up just as an overview of what healthy work cultures look like and what toxic work cultures look like. And we know that in toxic cultures, leaders see team members as expendable, they exploit them. The behavior becomes this idea of like, that's just the way we do things around here. And so, leaders are out of touch. They focus on short-term results at the expense of long-term results. They use power and fear, not motivation or facts. There's a lack of transparency. subjective, lax standards. Team members, as a result, don't respect the leaders and they leave. Leaders might ignore requests for meetings, have meetings that aren't helpful. And then there's like this snowball effect where those who remain are less productive, less committed because they see this toxic work environment. And the more team members push back at this, the more leaders want to get rid of them. There are two types of workplace cultures. This information comes from Andrew Foss, who wrote The Bully's Trap. And he groups these toxic work cultures into dictatorial cultures and then disjointed cultures, which we'll get into. But in these types of cultures, the dictator's power is the focus here. Blind obedience is expected. There's a strong hierarchy, bureaucracy, secrecy with no transparency. And there's this kind of these blame games that happen. They punish team members when things go wrong, or people blow the whistle in order to keep them in line. And then the disjointed cultures is more of a passive approach to management. There's not this alignment to purpose, values, or vision. There's little structure, there's little discipline, little motivation, all because the leaders are losing sight of the reason that their organization exists. So they don't have clear, fair, reasonable, measurable expectations, and they cover up wrongdoings and discredit others. It's really this, like I said, a passive approach. In healthy cultures, leaders fully understand that people are the key to the success of their organization, and they view abuse as this organizational risk, and they monitor indicators of it. So we know that this is not most employers, but when we do see it, we see that there's a common, well understood vision and mission, long-term plan. They drive out fear, reward compassion. They consistently apply rules and clearly define roles, responsibilities, and accountability. And they model this behavior, respect, honesty, open communication. They understand that employees, above everything else, want to be on winning teams. They set out goals, preferably SMART goals, of things that can be measurable, treating their employees like customers. They're not afraid to experiment with new ideas. They dampen rather than amplify power differentials. So they're really mixing in with team members and asking questions, seeing how they can better serve them, asking what they need, that sort of thing. And they're treating their team members fairly. They know that their actions matter. They know that competition undermines the team. Because there's this high level of transparency, there's not this overall fear of retaliation from making mistakes. They see things as learning opportunities. And then there's this culture where leaders know what abuse looks like because everybody in the company knows what it looks like. There have been trainings on it. There's accountability for toxic behavior. They're monitoring the culture, and they're actually not hiring people who show signs of toxic behaviors in the first place. When we get to the third stage of the playbook, by the time that all of this has happened, there is this dominant story and that's narrated by the employer. So really, first the bully controlling the narrative, then the employer controlling the narrative. And after pushback and reporting efforts fail, the target feels trapped. The bullying isn't letting up. The employer isn't helping. The stress has taken its toll. We say that, either people leave, they're fired because by this time they can't necessarily perform their jobs well because of the stress that they're under, or there's death that occurs. We've seen suicides, homicides, just death from the stress incurred. Bullies rarely lose their jobs. And like I've mentioned before, when workplace bullying is tolerated, the bullies can become even more aggressive. And then this toxicity is bolstered even more by bystanders who know that if they speak up too, they're not going to receive support from management either. Tim Fields, who was an anti-bullying activist, says, when bullies act with impunity, the institutional culture comes to be dominated by fear and self-seeking behavior. Innovation and cooperation become risky and thus rare. The serial bully's inefficiency and dysfunction can spread through an organization like a cancer. So this is really about how are leaders leading and how are they designing their work culture. We actually last year in 2021 did a survey in Massachusetts of mostly, I think it was around 500 something respondents, and most of them were public employees. And we found that from that data, and this is supported by other studies, but when I should say targets are most likely to either leave, or you can see here in the third column, get terminated, whereas the bully is much less likely to leave or get terminated. So, there's this data actually supports the ideas in this playbook. We often recommend in the short-term disengagement, detachment. I find that a lot of targets who have experienced this and see this playbook see that it is a playbook, and they are able to internalize less of what's going on because there is so much gaslighting, where the bully is trying to change the perceptions and have their target question their own perceptions and sanity. So it becomes easy for us as targets to really internalize what we're going through and push back as we keep questioning the narrative. But once you realize that this is, abuse is abuse, and that sits squarely on their shoulders, then we can, in the short term, while we're building a safety net, disengage or detach from what we're experiencing as much as we can. And then in this fourth stage of this playbook, the mobbing also leads to psychological trauma, where victimized employees trusted their employer and are blindsided by this betrayal of non-response. And a lot of this is first realized in the aftermath when they're out of their work and the job loss has occurred, and their sense of safety has been violated, and they feel this sense of trauma. Their expectations were up here, and the reality is down here, and that creates these feelings of loss and trauma. And then when they realize they have no legal recourse unless there's some discrimination involved, which is, like I said, we'll get into that in a bit. They can face allegations of mental illness, disbelief by doctors, therapists, family, and friends. So all of this toxicity compounds and adds further to the feelings of isolation. There are a ton of physical, psychological, emotional, professional, and economic long-term injuries associated with this. With the mind-body connection, it can start out as feelings of anxiety, depression, shame, and then result in things here like hypertension, heart disease, I mentioned depression, substance abuse, insomnia, chronic fatigue, anything stress related, digestive issues. Post-traumatic stress disorder is very common with this. There's also avoidance, impact on our identities, paranoia, hypervigilance. We see that a lot when people go into their next roles. There's numbness, flashbacks, confusions. I mentioned that earlier about the gaslighting, of the questioning of one's own perceptions, intense feelings of shame and humiliation, overwhelmed coping skills, impaired cognitive function, intense fear and worry that we can go into this fight or flight response. And then that can contribute, this chronic stress can contribute to bipolar disorder, suicidal ideation, and suicide. I haven't included this in here, but once we've lost our jobs, the effects can compound. So we're left to decide when we leave our jobs of what, between our health and a paycheck. And if we choose our health and leave, I've seen people lose their houses, their homes, their marriages, because of the stress and that being brought into their relationships. People can go bankrupt from this, homelessness, just the aftermath, the effects really compound in this. And then, in the job here, there can be deterioration of work product, like I've mentioned, further damage to professional reputation, job loss, and then jeopardizing of future career and financial prospects, which keep the targeted employee trapped and then exacerbate those effects. I'm going to talk a bit about bystanders, because that can add to the losses here and the feelings of isolation and trauma. So, but bystanders also experience depression, sleeping problems, headaches, strain, fatigue. They're really having these symptoms that are mirrored or similar to what targeted employees experience. They quit at almost the same rate as targeted employees. In this quote from Bob Sutton from 2007, he says, researchers in the UK found that more than 1/3 of witnesses wanted to intervene to help victims, but were afraid to do so. So there's all sorts of reasons that bystanders don't intervene, with fear being a major one of those reasons. Like I mentioned before, even HR reps are not protected against retaliation if they side with a bullied employee. And then, because many employees leave the organization, this starts to change the face of the organization, where fear has taken its toll and has this commanding influence over people's interactions, undermines healthy cooperation, problem solving, and performance. So it really leaves this increasingly toxic culture. Businesses also suffer from this problem, and the losses that they suffer far outweigh the benefits. So even when the bully is a great performer, by all other accounts except their toxic behaviors, the costs can still outweigh the benefits. So some of the business costs include turnover, lost opportunity, absenteeism, presenteeism, litigation, severances, settlements, workers' comp claims, disability insurance claims. And researcher Christine Porath says time wasted at work or spent searching for another job could cost companies up to $300 billion a year. And that is more than the total net profit of the Fortune 500 companies. So there are huge losses to our economy for tolerating bullying, which I'm gonna get into those societal costs here. So this actually takes a toll on our unemployment and healthcare systems, because the costs then fall onto taxpayers. Our government hospitals are left to deal with the sick, traumatized, unemployed, and uninsured citizens, because as we lose our jobs, usually our healthcare goes out the door too. Jeffrey Pfeffer, who is a Stanford professor in 2018, wrote this great book called Dying for a Paycheck, where he really talks about how employers externalize these costs onto taxpayers rather than just dealing with well-being internally. So he says the United States experiences about 59,000 excess deaths and about 63 billion in incremental costs annually, compared to what would be predicted given its per capita income level. Considering the total toll previously estimated of about 120,000 excess deaths and 180 billion in costs, our analyses indicate that about half of the deaths and about 1/3 of the incremental costs from workplace conditions appear to be potentially preventable if the United States were more similar to other advanced industrialized economies. So this is really about employers, taxpayers and hospitals really taking on these massive costs because we are not addressing well-being in our workplaces. Okay, so here's the part where I'm going to talk about the connection to discrimination. And this gets into our whole culture, this system of stereotypes that we are operating in, and with some people being positively stereotyped, some being negatively stereotyped. I want to bring up this survey that we did again with Massachusetts with mostly public employees. And on the left side here is the data on gender. You can see that with the blue part, people self-reporting that they were bullied, and the red saying that they weren't bullied. Proportionally, women have been on the receiving end of bullying more often than men do. And then when it comes to race, we see that non-white workers overwhelmingly have experienced bullying more. They're more likely to have, or they have experienced bullying more than white workers. So there is a discriminatory impact when it comes to workplace abuse that anti-discrimination law is not addressing. There's this phenomenal book called Rights on Trial that looks at the effectiveness of anti-discrimination law over the last 50 years or so. And they actually report here for 2015, the median incomes, and really, I mean, not only are Latino women getting about, or in 2014, we're getting about half of the median income as Asian American men, but there really, you can see there really hasn't been much of a disruption in these social hierarchies at work since the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So, as I've said, workplace bullying and mobbing are not isolated problems. They are embedded in this system of sexism, racism, ageism, homophobia, transphobia, classism, ableism, all of these ways of othering people that we have not addressed. Part of this has to do with the fact that the courts in the 1990s went from viewing discrimination as discriminatory impacts. So in the early days of anti-discrimination, there was actually some progress when the courts looked at things like hiring practices or pay equity. But in the 1990s, they moved more heavily to having to prove discriminatory intent, which is a much higher threshold. And it left people in all of these groups less protected and people outside of these groups less protected. So the question often comes up when we're being bullied at work, like, is this sexism? Is this racism? Or is this just mistreatment for some other reason? When we look at these laws, like I mentioned, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, age discrimination, the Age Discrimination in Employment Act of 1967, and the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, victims do not have a legal claim if they cannot tie the abuse to discriminatory intent. So a hostile work environment not associated with an employee's membership in a protected group is not actionable under these laws, and therefore results in no protection of psychological safety. So a quote from this book, these three authors who are academic professors, they say the courts have moved in the direction of treating employment discrimination as a set of individual cases of intentional misbehavior, while the social science literature on discrimination increasingly points to a widespread systemic character of bias in the organization of workplaces. So this is kind of the one of the main reasons why there hasn't been much change, because as I said earlier, employers are really looking at these cases as individual cases and vilifying employees because they have more power, instead of looking at this as embedded in this discriminatory system. And so employers are choosing to view psychological abuse through this loophole in the law, which is not an adequate lens to control the outcome. The 2016 EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission Select Task Force for the Study of Workplace Harassment, found this to be true. When they studied racial and ethnic harassment, they found that 70% of respondents reported experiencing some form of verbal harassment, and 45% reported experiencing exclusionary behaviors. 35% of LGBT identified respondents reported being open at work and having been harassed. Open at work reported having been harassed in the workplace. The thing when people make complaints to the EEOC or their state's commission, they find that the EEOC will either issue them a right to sue letter or they won't. There are very rare cases where the EEOC will actually step in and do something, help to litigate the situation or help to actually address it. They have not been effective in reducing the number of cases filed. So in 1983, there were 9,000 cases filed. In 2014, there were 13,831. And in 2020, they had a backlog of over 41,000 cases. The Workplace Bullying Institute, there is this overlap, but their data shows that 20% of the cases can be of workplace abuse can be lumped under this law, this anti-discrimination law, and be deemed as illegal discrimination. But when there is that need to prove discriminatory intent, or we know that we're mistreated, but we don't know what their intent is, or we can't, maybe somebody's a woman being mistreated by a woman, and therefore sexism may be difficult to prove. That leaves a huge pocket of people who can't have this direct connection to illegal discrimination. So that brings us into the case for legislation. Workplace culture, there's this great podcast episode on Brene Brown's podcast with an MIT Sloan professor and his son. And they talk about the fact that workplace culture, it tops the list of factors that contribute to psychologically unsafe work environments. And they know this by looking at record attrition rates. And attrition means employees lost over a period of time who were not replaced. So this could be people leaving. It could also be people retiring. They said between April and September of 2021, more than 24 million American employees left their jobs, which was an all-time record. And their study also found that corporate culture is a much more reliable predictor of industry-adjusted attrition than how employees assess their compensation. A toxic corporate culture is 10.4 times more powerful than compensation in predicting a company's attrition rate compared with its industry. The interesting thing here is that we lose more workers each year, at least 4,000, to preventable occupational injury, which includes psychological injury. And that number is more than the number of people we lost on 9/11, which was a little under 3,000 people. But after 9/11, our government instituted these expensive, comprehensive homeland security regulations to prevent this dramatic loss of life. And yet we're not addressing workplace safety. There's this big gaping hole in our law. And even though that number exceeds the number lost on 9/11. When countries have laws against workplace abuse, Amy talked about this before we started here, that there are more protections in a lot of other countries. The US is really behind on this specific issue. When we look at this chart here, we can see the gray bars are countries that don't have a law against workplace bullying. The purple ones are ones that do. We can see that the incidences of people reporting experiencing bullying at work go up in the absence of a law. We are the only Western industrialized nation that does not have anti-bullying legislation, except recently in the US territory of Puerto Rico. And I will say from that earlier chart that Canada doesn't fully have legislation across the board either. It is only restricted to Quebec. Yeah, we are behind. And more extensive research studies have come from other countries because they have complete data at the national level. Their single payer universal health systems provide more data on health incomes that we don't have here. The National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health says, according to this look at total worker health in one of the documents that they have from April 2016, you can see that workers' psychological or workplace psychological safety is the only component of worker total health that is unaddressed in US law. And yet all of these pieces of of worker total health really influence each other. So as an example, stress can lead to substance abuse, which can lead to on-site injuries. They really depend on each other. So this is a major oversight that we don't address this in the US effectively, or in kind of at all, except in Puerto Rico. And we do not have effective employee health programs because we leave out this major piece of the puzzle. Training and policies alone have failed to bring out change. Courts actually look at the existence of a policy in place to actually side with employers, which, according these two quotes are both from the authors of Rights on Trial, and this can be seen, what they're saying is symbolic compliance, where they have this policy, but they're not actually enforcing it, which is a major thing that we have seen with this issue, or it just might not be effective. And in California and Tennessee, they have passed really watered down versions of another piece of legislation that was introduced. So there is a requirement for training on workplace bullying in California. There is no data to support whether it's been enforced, whether it's working. There's no evidence to support that it is working. And then there is a model policy that employers can use in Tennessee, but neither have shown any real change in psychological safety at work if the data is even being tracked. No, the laws on the books, a lot of people say, oh, well, this is already covered. It is not. Employers or employment lawyers who study this issue say that, workers' comp insurance plans and common law tort pay-to-play provisions, they don't adequately address this. With workers' comp, employers kind of control the process there. They pay the premiums so they can challenge complaints and to keep their premiums low. Intentional infliction of emotional distress is a law on the books, but it requires proof of intent and severity. So there's an extremely high threshold with that. So that's been insufficient to change work cultures. And then there is the option that other legislation has proposed, and our legislation actually also proposes of a direct lawsuit, but without any other options for workers. This is really kind of not an option for low-wage workers because we do have a pay-to-play legal system, and this would make, suing a direct lawsuit unaffordable to so many people who are the most likely to experience abuse at work. I want to also add that the relationships that employers have with the courts and building into their budgets, money set aside for legal cases, that sets up this huge David versus Goliath setup where employees are pulling into their life savings to mount this legal case, and employers just have to, there's no personal attachment to this. All they have to do is tap into their budget and know that they already have existing relationships with the courts. And in some cases, tapping into that budget can include tuition fees, tax dollars, insurance money, all of these funding sources to fund their legal responses. What we have looked at that is effective is on the physical hazard side, not the psychological hazard side, is OSHA having this half-century track record of intervention with psychological safety, because OSHA doesn't focus on psychological safety. Targets have reported not having luck with them. But if with legislation they were tasked with intervening with psychological safety, we could really get at this issue. Since OSHA was enacted in the occupational health and safety laws around this, worker deaths in America are down on average from about 38 worker deaths a day in 1970 to 15 a day in 2019. Worker injuries and illnesses are down from 10.9 incidents per 100 workers to 172 in 1972 to 2.8 per 100 in 2019. And at the same time, US employment nearly doubled. So one thing that we're hearing with the introduction of legislation is that the floodgates will open for legislation. But with the introduction of OSHA, the courts were not flooded with lawsuits, and employers complied with the law to reduce their threat of liability. The development of sexual harassment law also informs our decisions, or our direction, I should say. The Supreme Court has already decided that a hostile work environment is enough to be actionable. So in the Meritor Savings Bank versus Vincent case in 1986, they found that a claim of hostile work environment sexual harassment is a form of sex discrimination that is actionable under Title VII. And then in 1993, with the Harris versus Forklift Systems case, they said to be actionable as abusive work environment harassment conduct not need seriously affect an employee's psychological well-being or lead the plaintiff to suffer injury, which basically says that there can be a legal claim for a hostile work environment, and the health harm does not need to occur in order to have a legal claim. So this has already been decided in the 80s and 90s with these two cases. Which brings me to the Workplace Psychological Safety Act. Our goal here is awareness and prevention. We know that no law will fully eradicate a problem, so we're really trying to lean on this preventative side. We know that sexual harassment law hasn't gotten rid of sexual harassment, but it moved the needle on safer workplaces, even with pushback from the courts over the years. And our goal is the same with this. We want to move the needle on safer workplaces. We want to create a norm that psychological abuse at work is unacceptable. We want targeted employees to know that society is on their side. That's another, layer of betrayal when employees find out that there is no law against them. It feels like they feel the sense of betrayal from the government and society that this is not an issue of importance. If this bill passes, it will not be perfect, but it will be progress. And we want to accomplish our goals by calling for consequences that have the best chance of moving the needle on safer workplaces. So the basics are that it would give targeted employees legal recourse for a toxic work environment. Employers would have to acknowledge, monitor, detect, prevent, discourage, and adequately address incidences of psychological abuse. And like I mentioned before, we're not focusing on intent or negligence. We're focusing on these specific toxic behaviors that are most likely to happen, to go up against the system on the advice of a practicing employment lawyer that would create a toxic work environment to a reasonable person. So it calls for policies and trainings, but this is not nearly the only piece of it. They would have to employers would have to adopt internal policies, train their new employees and current employees on it, and then post the information in an accessible manner. Because this starts out with monitoring their client, we're calling for an annual anonymous workplace climate survey that would be submitted to the government so that employers can first know if there is a workplace bullying problem in their organizations. And then when I described in the playbook, the abuser playbook, that this is really a case where employers can just drag this investigation and reporting out for months, sometimes years. So we're really getting at this, that they have 5 days to start some kind of complaint process, 30 days to actually conduct the investigation from the first day of the initial complaint and inform the complainant of the outcome. We have a system set up that is modeled after workers' compensation fees to fund positions where the employers themselves, instead of externalizing onto taxpayers the costs, they would actually pay fees on like a scale based on the size, essentially, of their income, rather. And of course, with good reason, there can be delays in this process, but the employee deserves some sort of communication, and you know, the employer trying to stick to this time frame as much as possible. If the outcome favors the complainant, there needs to be at a minimum an apology, but mostly reinstatement of work, coaching, counseling, or discipline of the employee who violated the act. And then if there are further violations, you know, then they would take necessary steps in the disciplinary process. When we drafted this bill, we you know, questioned, how is this bill going to be different from anything else that's been proposed that looks at this issue as an individual problem? And we said, let's make employers have to submit information on you know, what's going on in their organization. So we're calling for a quarterly report on number of employee complaints, number of employee disciplines, workers' comp claims, absenteeism rates, termination rates, stress leave rates, attrition rates, discrimination and psychological abuse reporting, investigation rates, follow-up action rates, and then for the tie-in to that discrimination piece, also on the workforce gender and racial makeup of their staff, and de-identified wage and salary data by protected category so that we can see who's working in the company and how they're being paid without identifying who they are, and hopefully making this information publicly available on a website, but at a minimum accessible under the Freedom of Information Act. If an employer, you know, takes reasonable care to prevent this issue, to promptly correct it, then they would be held harmless. There is in the bill an opportunity for a lawsuit directed at the employer and separately at the individual perpetrator. And in this piece, the immunity will not be extended to that individual. We believe this is the strongest of any bill. The employee options include the ability to file a restraining order, to use the internal investigation process, but they don't have to actually use that process. They can seek outside assistance by filing a complaint with either OSHA for private sector employees, or their states. In Massachusetts is the Department of Labor Standards, or some sort of similarly charged office for public sector employees, where HR would get notified before, you know, the lawsuit happens, but they're not using, if they have reason to believe, or they just don't, you know, trust in the process, but they have reason to believe that there's some sort of rigged process, they don't have to use it. And that's the piece that the low wage workers can use to try to seek some help on this issue. And then of course somebody can sue directly. In terms of employer liability, it would include failing to take the appropriate measures that are outlined in the act, engaging in violations of the act. They'd be responsible for economic, compensatory, punitive damages. This is all sort of outlined in what types of damages they employees could get, and if the employer is not prevailing, they would be liable for the employee's reasonable attorneys and witness fee costs. We actually, when we drafted this bill, we looked at what was happening in other countries in terms of their protections. You know, Sweden was the first to introduce something, and we have this outlined on our website at workplacepsychologicalsafetyact.org. But France actually calls for criminal liability with the individual who was the perpetrator. So we wanted to add that into this bill, and then also be mindful that an employer could potentially use this bill to further abuse an employee. So we said that employers and employees can be held liable under this act, but an employer cannot hold an employee civilly or criminally liable under the act. And then if we put in a statute of limitations of 3 years, knowing that there's some recovery healing time involved with this, and other proposed legislation of 1 year, or, that's just not sufficient for how much time someone would need to kind of rebuild, or heal and recover from what they went through to then go through the usual re-trauma of a legal case. So I'm gonna, as we're kind of approaching the end here, talk about our movement. We have heard throughout our work that banning at-will employment is sort of giving workers a baseline of rights. And so a lot of countries operate on using employment contracts. And so we want to ban at-will employment. There is actually an active bill in Massachusetts. A lot of people will say, well, I'm in an at-will state. Almost everybody in this country is in an at-will state unless you are in Montana. That's a whole different story, but we want to make wrongful termination and constructive discharge, where an employee is pushed out of the organization, we want to make both of those illegal by also introducing an at-will employment bill that we are working on. When it comes to the Workplace Psychological Safety Act, we're taking an approach where we want people across the country to really try to get efforts, or try to get a bill passed in some of the progressive states first, and the cities by way of a city ordinance. So we're focusing on these states, these cities, really any city that someone wants to introduce the bill in. We will be introducing it in Massachusetts. And we have some action in a few other states listed here, but we're really trying to find people in these states and cities to try to introduce this piece of legislation. We also have a website, endworkplaceabuse.com, where people can take action in their states on all of these. There's like 24 different issues, workers' rights issues, that we've identified as forms of workplace abuse, where, if you're not getting paid a fair minimum wage, or you're asked to sign a non-disclosure agreement so you can't, voice what you went through. These are all forms of abuse. And so you can actually go to endworkplaceabuse.com, click on your state anywhere in the country, and it will bring you to this automated form. A lot of states have already ended their legislative sessions, but you can still, send in support for these pieces of legislation that are, when you click on a state, it will tell you what those issues are. You can send a template letter to your state legislators, well, without even having to know who they are, because you just put in your address, the template letter pops up, you can change it, you could delete the whole thing and rewrite whatever you want to say, and then send it off and show your support. And this website also identifies which states are introducing or have introduced these pieces of legislation, and in some cases, which states have actually passed some of them. And then here's the website for the Workplace Psychological Safety Act, where there's different flyers you can use to help spread the word. There's all sorts of information on different aspects of this issue, around the discrimination piece, around OSHA, some of the things that I've explained today. We also run trainings on how to lobby, how to convince your state legislators or other legislators to co-sponsor the bill or support it in some way. And then also to testify at a public hearing or to submit written testimony in support of legislation. We're also running an event this weekend on Saturday from 1 to 2 on the Massachusetts State House steps. We're trying to get as many people as possible to use their voices to educate people on what this is. We're honoring 15 lives lost to workplace bullying and mobbing. And really the power of the events that we run is to take back our voices, take us out of this isolation that we experience, and then give other people permission to speak up. So we've run, this will be the second one that we're running this year. We'll probably be running a couple events per year, and then maybe having some online type of events as well. But if you can join us, we would love to have you there with us. And then the last part here, I want to talk about navigating and healing. This is what I focus on through my work with Dignity Together. And in my course on navigating, get more in depth into these layers of betrayal, what I call the detachment framework, in my course on navigating. And then on the healing side, it's really about, in the first stages of it, sharing the facts, the feelings, the losses around it in a way where we can feel seen and heard, and really give guidance on how to receive something in a way to help somebody else feel seen and heard. And then this is not a linear process, but grieving those losses, ruminating on what happened to try to process through, try to process all the details and really get clarity on where the blame lies in the situation. Ultimately leading to reframing the narrative, really, and reframing some of the things that we tell ourselves that can help us feel stuck. One of the big ones is, well, I should have known that I should have seen the signs earlier. So we talk about, how we can reframe some of these things that we're telling ourselves in a more healing way, in a way that can help us stand in our power. And then ultimately getting to a place of recovery where we know what our values are. We can intentionally carve our lives out based on those values. And we can, the pain of what we went through isn't interfering with our day-to-day lives anymore. Also knowing that connection is really the antidote to trauma. So by design, bullies want us to feel disconnected, want us to feel isolated with their toxic behavior. So we really lean on connection as the antidote to trauma. So there's online courses for navigating and healing, free peer support groups every Wednesday night on Zoom at 7 p.m. I am a certified life coach, so I offer online coaching around this issue in particular, and then virtual and in-person summits and retreats. So that's it. If anyone has any questions, feel free to reach out to me at info@dignitytogether.org. And I thought we could open it up here for key takeaways, what's resonated with you with your experience, and just have a discussion about this. So I'm going to stop sharing.
That's so much great